Everyone's watching the wrong ocean. Right now, as you're watching this, there are Pentagon briefings about China's aircraft carriers, congressional hearings about hypersonic missiles, cable news segments showing destroyers cutting through the South China Sea. And all of it, every single frame, is a distraction from the real story. Because China didn't conquer the seas with warships. They conquered them with cargo ships, fishing boats, and port cranes. And by the time the world figured it out, it was already over. You clicked on this video because somewhere in your gut, you sense the mainstream narrative doesn't add up. Why does every headline focus on aircraft carriers and missile counts when the real power shift is happening in plain sight? That framing misses something so fundamental, so massive in scale, that when I lay it out for you with real numbers, you're going to see global power completely differently. By the end of this video, you'll understand the 3 quiet mechanisms China used to take control of the world's oceans without deploying a single combat fleet. And I promise you, nobody is connecting these dots the way I'm about to. Here's what the mainstream gets completely wrong. They treat naval power like it's 1944, battleships, carrier strike groups, force projection through firepower. But the ocean isn't just a battlefield. It's a highway. It's a factory floor. It's a supply chain. And whoever controls the highway, the factory, and the supply chain doesn't need to fire a shot. They already won. Let me show you what this actually means. Start with shipbuilding, not the sexy kind, not nuclear submarines or stealth destroyers. I'm talking about commercial shipbuilding, the container ships, bulk carriers, and tankers that move 80% of everything you touch, wear, eat, and use. In 2023, China delivered 49.7 million compensated gross tons of commercial vessels. That's not about half the global market. That's 55.3% of every commercial ship built on Earth last year. South Korea came second with 26.8%. Japan, third at 14.2%. The United States, less than 1%. The country with the most powerful military navy in human history builds less than 1% of the world's commercial ships. This is the shipbuilding paradox, and it's one of the most underreported power shifts of the 21st century. And here's what nobody tells you about why that matters. Whoever builds the ships controls the standards, the technology, the supply chains for parts, the steel, the electronics, the navigation systems. When I visited a shipyard outside Shanghai 2 years ago, an engineer told me something that stuck with me. He said, "America builds weapons to protect the ocean. We build the ocean itself." He wasn't being poetic, he was being literal. China now operates over 1,700 shipyards. The United States has fewer than 20 capable of building large ocean-going vessels. And it's not just volume, it's speed. Chinese yards can deliver a commercial vessel in 14 to 18 months. American yards take 3 to 5 years for comparable tonnage, at 4 to 6 times the cost. Think about what that means strategically. In a prolonged conflict, China could replace lost commercial tonnage faster than the US could build a single replacement vessel. That's not a military advantage, that's an existential one. So when people ask me, is China's Navy a threat? I tell them they're asking the wrong question entirely. The Navy everyone should be worried about doesn't fly a military flag. It flies commercial pennants. It carries your furniture, your electronics, your grain, your oil, and it answers to Beijing. But shipbuilding is only the first layer of this, because building the ships means nothing if you don't control where they dock. And this is where China pulled off what I consider the most ambitious infrastructure play in modern history. One that makes the Belt and Road Initiative's highways and railways look like a warm-up act. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything about how you understand global trade. We're talking about a network of ports, strategically positioned, quietly acquired, and now so deeply embedded in global commerce that most countries didn't even realize they'd handed over the keys until it was too late. And the numbers behind this network? They should genuinely unsettle you. Let me show you the numbers that matter. China's state-owned companies now hold operating stakes in over 96 ports across 53 countries. Not partnerships, not investments. Operating stakes, meaning they have direct influence over how those ports run, who gets priority berthing, what data flows through the logistics systems, and in some cases, who gets to dock at all. Costco Shipping Ports, just one Chinese state-linked company, handled 130.2 million TEUs in 2023. That's 20-foot equivalent units, the standard measure for container traffic. To put that in perspective, that single company moved more container volume than the entire port systems of the United States and the United Kingdom combined. Most people think China's port strategy is about trade, but here's what's really happening. It's about dependency. And the case study that should keep every Western strategist up at night is Piraeus. Piraeus is Greece's largest port. In 2008, it was struggling, ranked 93rd globally in container throughput. Then Costco stepped in, took a majority stake, and poured 1.5 billion euros into modernization. By 2019, Piraeus had rocketed to number 25 in the world. Container volume grew by over 700%. Sounds like a success story, right? A win-win? Here's the uncomfortable part. In 2017, Greece blocked an EU statement at the United Nations criticizing China's human rights record. It was the first time the EU had ever failed to deliver a unified human rights statement at the UN. Diplomats across Brussels were stunned, but when reporters dug into it, the thread led straight back to Piraeus. Greece wasn't going to bite the hand that rebuilt its most critical piece of trade infrastructure. A senior European diplomat told me off the record in 2022, and I'm paraphrasing carefully here, "We didn't lose Greece to military pressure. We lost it to a shipping terminal." That's not an isolated incident. Pakistan's Gwadar port, Sri Lanka's Hambantota, where the government literally handed over a 99-year lease when it couldn't repay Chinese construction loans. Djibouti, where China built its first overseas military base right next to commercial port facilities. Darwin, Australia, where a Chinese company secured a 99-year lease on the port closest to a U.S. Marine rotation base. The pattern repeats over and over. And if you're finding this valuable, hit that like button, because this research takes months to compile, and most of it never makes mainstream coverage. Now, here's what matters about this port network that almost nobody discusses. It's not just about moving goods. Every modern port runs on data. Logistics software tracks every container, every manifest, every shipment. And when a Chinese state-linked company operates the port, that data flows through systems built by Chinese tech firms. Think about what intelligence agencies would pay for that information. You'd know exactly what a country is importing, what raw materials they're stockpiling, what military components are moving through civilian channels. You'd have a real-time economic X-ray of every nation in your network without hacking a single system. You built the system. This is what I call the logistics telescope. China doesn't need spy satellites to understand a country's economic health. They just need to read the shipping manifests from the ports they operate. But even all of this, the shipbuilding dominance, the port network, the data infrastructure, still doesn't complete the picture, because there's a third element at play, and it might be the most audacious of all. It doesn't look strategic. It doesn't make headlines. When Western analysts see it, they dismiss it as irrelevant. And that's precisely why it works. I'm talking about a fleet so vast, it dwarfs every navy on Earth combined, not in tonnage, not in firepower, in sheer numbers. A fleet that operates in legal gray zones, that reshapes territorial claims without treaties, that depletes resources and displaces rivals, all while technically doing nothing more than catching fish. China's distant water fishing fleet officially numbers around 2,900 vessels, but independent tracking by the Overseas Development Institute puts the real number closer to 17,000. And what this armada actually does has almost nothing to do with fishing. 17,000 vessels. Let that sink in for a moment. The U.S. distant water fishing fleet, around 300 vessels. The entire European Union combined, roughly 700. China operates a fishing fleet larger than the next 10 nations put together, and most of it is invisible to official tracking systems. Here's the uncomfortable truth that no government wants to admit publicly. These aren't really fishing boats. They're a maritime militia dressed in civilian clothing. I spent 3 weeks in 2021 interviewing fishermen in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. What they described wasn't commercial competition. It was coordinated intimidation. Hundreds of Chinese vessels appearing overnight in disputed waters, anchoring in formations, refusing to leave for months, blocking local fishermen from traditional grounds their families had worked for generations. One Filipino captain, a weathered guy who'd been fishing the Spratly region for 40 years, told me something I'll never forget. He said, "They don't fish, they just occupy. They sit there, lights on all night, and we cannot work. If we approach, 10 more boats appear. We have no navy to call. We have nothing." And he's right. What do you do when 200 fishing boats park themselves on a reef you claim as sovereign territory? You can't shoot at them, they're civilians. You can't board them, that's an international incident. You can't ignore them, because after 6 months, China points to their continuous presence as evidence of territorial control. This is the gray zone genius that Western military strategists still haven't solved. You can't fight what isn't technically a war. Let me show you what the numbers reveal. The Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative tracked vessel activity at Whitsun Reef in March 2021. They documented 220 Chinese vessels moored in a single cluster. Satellite imagery showed they weren't moving. They weren't deploying nets. They sat in formation for weeks. The Philippine government protested. China claimed they were sheltering from rough seas. The seas were calm. This happens continuously across the South China Sea, but it's not limited to disputed waters. Chinese fishing vessels have been tracked operating illegally off the coasts of Argentina, Ecuador, Ghana, Somalia, and North Korea. Global Fishing Watch's analysis of 2022 data found Chinese flagged vessels spent over 830,000 hours fishing in other nations' exclusive economic zones, often with transponders deliberately switched off. And here's what makes people genuinely uncomfortable. Many of these vessels receive direct subsidies from Beijing, fuel subsidies, construction subsidies, operating subsidies. The Chinese government spent an estimated $7.2 billion on fishing subsidies in 2018 alone, more than the next 8 countries combined. Why would a government pay billions to keep a marginally profitable fishing fleet operational at global scale? Because they're not paying for fish, they're paying for presence. Every vessel is a floating claim. Every anchored boat is a statement of territorial intent. Every captain with a satellite phone is a potential intelligence asset, reporting foreign naval movements in real time. A retired PLA officer, speaking to researchers at the Naval War College, described the fleet's actual purpose with surprising candor. He called it Little Blue Men, the maritime equivalent of the Little Green Men who appeared in Crimea before Russia's annexation. Deniable, civilian presenting, strategically deployed. When Western navies conduct freedom of navigation operations, they send a destroyer, make headlines, and leave. China sends hundreds of boats that never leave. Which approach actually changes facts on the water? This connects to something even bigger, and it's the synthesis that ties all 3 elements together. Shipbuilding dominance means China controls what vessels exist. The port network means they control where those vessels can efficiently operate. The fishing fleet means they control physical presence in contested waters without military escalation. It's a closed loop, a self-reinforcing system, and it was designed this way. When I asked a defense analyst in Singapore how the West missed this, she laughed and said, they were looking at the wrong ocean. They watched the warships and missed the cargo ships. They tracked the destroyers and ignored the trawlers. They debated aircraft carriers while China built everything underneath. She's right, and the implications of this blindness are about to become very, very expensive. Let me pull this together, because what we've covered isn't 3 separate strategies. It's one integrated machine, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. China built the ships, not warships, the vessels that carry civilization's lifeblood. They now construct more than half of every commercial vessel on Earth, while America builds less than 1%. That's not a gap. That's a generational surrender of industrial capacity. Then they bought the ports, 96 ports across 53 countries, operating stakes that give them eyes on global logistics, leverage over indebted nations, and the ability to shape trade flows without firing a single missile. Greece couldn't criticize China's human rights record. Sri Lanka handed over sovereign territory for 99 years. Pakistan's economy now routes through Chinese-controlled infrastructure. And finally, they deployed the invisible fleet, 17,000 fishing vessels that aren't really fishing, a maritime militia that occupies disputed waters, displaces competitors, and establishes presence through sheer persistence. No country has found an effective counter because there's nothing to counter. Officially, they're just fishermen. I call this framework the Invisible Navy Doctrine, and it represents the most successful territorial expansion since World War II, achieved entirely without military conquest. Here's what this actually means going forward. I see 3 scenarios unfolding, and none of them favor the status quo. Scenario 1, The dependency trap deepens. Countries already reliant on Chinese port infrastructure and shipping capacity find themselves unable to diversify. When 70% of your container traffic flows through Chinese-linked terminals, when your shipyards closed decades ago, when your own fishing fleet can't compete with subsidized Chinese vessels, you don't have choices anymore. You have one supplier, and that supplier has interests that may not align with yours. This is already reality for dozens of nations. It will become reality for dozens more within this decade. Scenario 2, the gray zone expands. What worked in the South China Sea gets exported. Chinese fishing vessels are already operating off West Africa, South America, and the Indian Ocean rim. The model is proven. Flood a zone with civilian vessels. Establish continuous presence. Wait for international attention to move elsewhere. Consolidate. When Western analysts asked why China would want fishing grounds off Ecuador, they missed the point entirely. It's not about fishing. It's about precedent. It's about proving that presence equals control and no one will stop you. Scenario 3, and this is the one that keeps me up at night. The system gets activated. Right now, the Invisible Navy operates in peacetime mode, commercial, deniable, but every ship China builds, every port they operate, every fishing vessel in their fleet represents latent strategic capacity. In a crisis, commercial ships become military transports, ports become denial points, fishing vessels become surveillance networks and blockade instruments. The switch from civilian to military use requires no new construction, just new orders. The weapon that was supposed to guarantee American dominance, overwhelming naval firepower, suddenly faces an opponent who doesn't need to match it. Because China doesn't need to sink the US Navy. They just need to own everything the US Navy is protecting. So where does this leave you? Watching this video means you already sensed something was wrong with the conventional narrative. You already suspected that aircraft carrier counts and missile inventories weren't telling the real story. Now you have the framework to understand what's actually happening. The ocean belongs to whoever shows up. And for the past 30 years, while America debated carrier groups and freedom of navigation, China showed up with shipyards, with port investments, with fishing boats, every single day, in every single ocean. The question isn't whether China has already won the contest for maritime supremacy. The question is whether anyone will realize it in time to matter. I'll leave you with what that Filipino fisherman told me, his voice flat with exhaustion after decades of watching his waters disappear. He said, "We waited for the warships to save us. They never came, and now there is nothing left to save." That's the Invisible Navy. That's what conquest looks like in the 21st century, not with a bang, with a shipping manifest. If this changed how you see global power, subscribe now. And tell me in the comments, which country do you think is most vulnerable to the Invisible Navy strategy? I read every response, and your answer might shape what I cover next. The world changed while everyone watched the wrong ocean. Now you know where to look.